Okay, today we're going to continue our look at the players, and we're going to be looking specifically at the former CN Rail Chief Operations Officer, Keith Creel, who is now the CEO at CPKC. All right, what we have here is basically a list of former CN Rail CEOs during the whole time frame for issues that play into the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney and more. But anyways, the CEOs, the first CEO was a man by the name of Paul Tellier, who was the former clerk of the Privy Council for the Government of Canada. In 1995 to 2002, he was CN Rail CEO. What's interesting about that is that the man who is now clerk of the Privy Council today, as Canada attempts to overhaul the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, is a man who worked for Paul Tellier, and his name is Michael Sabia. Sabia was also the chief financial officer at CN Rail. So it's kind of interesting that he is now clerk of the Privy Council when they're trying to do this second attempt to overhaul the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. And you have to wonder, what role did Sabia play during his former tenure under Paul Tellier or at CN Rail? Was he part of initiating training program changes, for example, without going through proper procedures as the Railway Safety Act Section 20 would have necessitated? Is that why Michael Sabia is now playing a role in this overhaul? Because he may have a personal interest? I don't know. I suspect it may be, but I have no way of knowing for sure. But definitely an issue to keep in the back of your mind. And then we had Hunter Harrison. He was the CEO of CN Rail from 2003 to 2009. Then it was a man by the name of Claude Mongeau, who would go on to be Norfolk Southern chairman of the board. Claude Mongeau was CEO when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. In my opinion, that man belongs behind bars. My opinion. You're free to form your own. Then we had Luc Jobin. More deaths under that man. And I may cover some of those later because there's definitely issues with some of those Transportation Safety Board reports. Then we had Jean-Jacques Ruet. And I cannot see how any of these people did not know that there was fake qualifications going on at CN Rail. From the time of Hunter Harrison in 2007 when we had the Mac Yard incident, all the way, in my opinion, to potentially today. Since if you've been fake qualified and you're still at CN Rail, and the Government of Canada knows that there were issues with proper qualifications as far as yard training, whatever, and you haven't been properly retrained, is that an issue? Especially when you go on to become a locomotive engineer, because if you're fake qualified as a conductor, you're fake qualified as a locomotive engineer. Training does not restart from scratch. So huge issue for anybody who was qualified in one of these small terminals or locations that do not count as actual yards. Now, on the other side here, the other block of names, those would have been the chief operations officers also during this time frame. So you had Hunter Harrison from 98 to 2002. Which would have been when CN was first, well, in 1995, it went to a publicly traded company. And so shortly after that, Harrison became the CEO. Then we had the chief operations officer. Then we had Ed Harris. Then we had Keith Creel. From 2007 to 2010, he was an executive vice president overseeing operations. But I need you to look here. The reason I have an arrow going down to this Google block here, when I did a search, I was looking for a list of who was the COO at CN Rail when the Mac Yard incident happened. It was quite a challenge trying to find this. But anyways, you can see here that what I had typed into Google was 2007 CN Rail names new COO, because I knew the one guy had left, Ed Harris, and I wanted to know who was the person who then took over for Ed Harris as Chief Operations Officer, because that person would have been there during the Mackyard incident. And gotta warn you folks, if you look at the green arrow, so you can see what was my search criteria, but then the second green arrow there shows that the AI overview provided the following information. In 2007, CN Rail did not name a new Chief Operating Officer. The position of COO was held by Keith Creel until he became President and CEO in January 2010, when Claude Mongeau took over. Folks, that sentence makes no sense. Keith Creel, this implies that Keith Creel became President and CEO in January 2010? Absolutely not. Claude Mongeau was the CEO of CN Rail in 2010 through 2016. So this is all, it's a garbled sentence, first of all. It doesn't even make sense when you read it, because it says Keith Creel became President and Chief Executive Officer in January 2010, and then it follows up when Claude Mongeau took over. You can't have those two together in one sentence. It would make it look like there's two CEOs at the same time. That was not the case. So be very careful of relying on, AI when you're doing research, because boy, you got to learn to question everything. And let me tell you, so this AI overview, what they provided is very wrong here. Creel was never CEO at CN Rail. But if a person reads this and, oh, I'm doing my research, and now all of a sudden all these papers, research documents, whatever, come out showing that Keith Creel was CEO at CN Rail in 2010, because that's what AI told me. Folks, this is how you get a whole lot of misinformation in databases and on the internet. AI has clearly not been tested enough if it's returning search information such as this. And so I would really caution people, be very careful when you trust only AI when you're doing research, because you may be going down a really nasty path. That's all I'm going to say on AI, but Keith Creel was never President and CEO at CN Rail. That was Claude Mongeau at that time. All right, well, the reason, it took me a lot longer to find out who was COO when the Mackyard incident happened is because of things like what was returned in via AI, but also if you look at Wikipedia, the top right screen here, basically when you do a search on Keith Creel, it tells you that he was an executive vice president in 2007, but it doesn't tell you that he was chief operations officer, that he was overseeing operations. It then tells you that he was chief operations officer in 2010. And so, well, there's a lot of executive VPs. And so you can't just assume that Keith Creel was executive VP overseeing operations. And you wouldn't have known he was in that role in 2007 if you, again, looked at what was provided in Wikipedia. But it took me a while to find this. And if you look on the left screen here, CN Rail's 2009 Investor Fact Book. Well, it doesn't get better than that. It's right from the source, CN Rail itself. But here, you would have had to have had the date 2009 to find this. But in this fact book, it stated Keith Creel was appointed Executive Vice President Operations in May 2007. In this role, Creel was responsible for the company's operations in Canada and in the United States. And so even though not physically in the U.S., any issues in that time pertaining to operations, deaths, whatever, that would have fallen under Keith Creel. So that is where I know for sure that Keith Creel was overseeing operations and was basically chief operations officer when the Mac Yard incident happened. It doesn't get better than taking it from a CN Rail 2009 investor fact book. So that's where I got this information that Keith Creel was indeed the person in charge when the Mac Yard incident happened, clearly showing a whole lot of fake qualifications was going on and people were not getting the training they were supposed to get. The Mac Yard incident happened in September of 2007, and then again, that launched the first attempt to rewrite the frontline rail worker training programs for all rail carriers operating in Canada. So Keith Creel, as COO of CN Rail at the time, would certainly have been a person, in my opinion, providing input into that effort. What I call a complete and total public scam. We're going to get into a whole lot more on that. But anyway, if you look here, in the other block I have, Keith Creel became the president and CEO of CPKC in April 2023. Before that, he was the CEO of CP Rail as of January 2017. He became the CP COO under Hunter Harrison at CP Rail in February of 2013. So he had already left CN Rail when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. However, I very much suspect a lot of the operational excellence that still remained at CN Rail, as far as the training materials, all of that, given the dates on those materials dated back to 2008, 2010, and that could have been a situation where we just had even older materials than that, and we just put a new cover page with a new date on it. So in my opinion, I think Keith Creel may have definitely had a hand in the use of extremely outdated training materials and potentially in the use of deadly training slide number 53, which was clearly in use at CN Rail at the time conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. What is the origin of deadly training slide number 53? How old is it? Does it date back to the days of 1995, prior to CN becoming a publicly traded company? I have a lot of suspicions that that slide may be extremely old, and that it was still being used, that it was used potentially to train thousands of frontline rail workers. So for more on that, I would really encourage you to look at the Deadly Training Materials series, because I don't think that all of the issues as far as the deadly training materials happened only after Keith Creel left. I suspect some of them may have been there before Keith Creel, during Keith Creel's tenure as COO, and potentially much later. And this whole thing would beg the question, how is it that chief operations officers, especially when you know there's fake qualifications going on, as the Mac Yard incident clearly showed, how could you care so little about frontline rail workers that you don't truly overhaul those training programs, even though they did a first attempt? To this day, the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, which is the regulation overseeing those training programs, has never been updated in 38 years. How can you care so little about frontline rail workers, especially when Transport Canada and the rail carriers themselves clearly knew there was fake qualifications going on? But hey, when you're rail partners in crime and you can sweep all that under the carpet and hide it from the public with those story du jour Transportation Safety Board reports, and for more on that, I would refer you to my analysis, my dissection of a rail worker death investigation pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. But how many of those changes to training programs were done under Keith Creel before Jim Vena took over? But again, Jim Vena, as Chief Operations Officer when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, did you not look at your frontline training programs? Did you not look to see if your systems were properly set up to catch any missing shifts, any missing yard trips, any missing evaluations, etc., especially since CN Rail, after the Mackyard incident, had committed to doing so much to improve the quality of their training programs and tracking and monitoring? All nice on paper, in my opinion, but I don't think any of it ever truly happened. So just my opinion. We're going to move on. All right, so the first table here is taken from the Mackyard Incident Railway Investigation Report. That would be R07T0270. And that table was provided on page 11, and it clearly showed that you were supposed to have a minimum of 45 trial trips, and that it was supposed to be under the supervision of an experienced conductor. In other words, one-on-one training, one person, and it should have been from the beginning to the end of your training. It doesn't say under the supervision of experienced conductors. That is not plural there. So that would imply one person from beginning to end for the program. But under Keith Creel in 2007, the training program was changed, and they were, well, whether or not it was formally changed, it certainly I don't think was approved by Transport Canada, which would be a violation of the Railway Safety Act Section 20. But the training program went from 5 to 6 months to complete to now being completed in 3 to 4 months. So did Keith Creel request that change under the Railway Safety Act Section 20, making, formally filing his program changes with Transport Canada and waiting for approval prior to field implementation? I seriously doubt it. I asked Transport Canada to give me and the Government of Canada to provide for me all training program changes that had been filed, etc., with the Government of Canada. And boy, that returned nothing, that particular request that I had made to the government. But also, if you look here at the bottom, again, observation trips now counted as trial trips. Well, an observation trip, you're just looking at how things are done. You're not actually completing the work. There is a huge difference between an observation trip and an actual trial trip where you're doing the actual work. And so, again, they were qualifying conductors with as little as 30 to 35 trips. And, if you take out the qualifying trips, if you look at this last block here, this last paragraph from page 14, where it says that the qualified conductor that was involved in the belt pack incident, in the Mackyard incident of September 2007, had completed 34 training trips and a qualifying test. No, those were not training trips, because 34 included the observation trips. This guy only had 22 evaluations on file. And that would mean that, maybe those other 12 would have been the observation trips, about 6 per week. That would be about right. For a 2-week period, that would be 12. So 34 minus 12 would have been 22, which would match the observation, the evaluation form number was 22. Were on file for this particular conductor trainee conductor trainee before he was qualified. So even though the report says 34 training trips, they're including those observation trips almost as if they are qualifying trips. They're not qualifying trips. They are observation trips. The field trips would have been the ones that counted. You can't, just because CN decided to lump them all together, it doesn't mean that the Transportation Safety Board should be doing so. That's not what the program was. You didn't have, weeks 3 and 4 lumped in with the minimum of 45 trial trips. Those were a completely different type of trip where the conductor trainee actually did the work. So huge issue. And so Transport Canada, the Transportation Safety Board, and CN under Keith Creel all knew fake qualifications were going on here. They were not qualifying conductors in accordance with the training program that was supposedly on file with Transport Canada per this table 1. And then it says here, prior to 2007, conductors were only qualified for 1 year and were required to retake the Canadian Rail Operating Rules exam. But there was a very high failure rate. And so because of that, since 2007, new conductors have been considered fully qualified for 3 years. Okay, so we got a high failure rate, probably because they're fake qualified to start with. And so we're going to extend their qualification card rather than fixing the problems with the training program and making sure they understand and comply with the tasks that they're supposed to be able to do and the rules under which they're supposed to operate. Well, we got a high failure rate, so instead of instead of fixing the actual problems, we're just going to make your cards good for 3 years. Doesn't that kind of make you think that maybe the training program should have remained at 2 years the way it was before CN Rail and CP became publicly traded companies when they were still Government of Canada companies? This training program used to take 2 years to be fully qualified. And so, when you fake qualify, I could see why you'd have a high failure rate after the 1 year, because you didn't qualify them properly to start with. They were fake qualified. There's no other way to put it. They were fake qualified. And that's what the facts actually show. So this thing of, we're going to make your card good for 3 years now. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know the rules you're supposed to operate under, but we're going to extend your qualification card to be good for 3 years instead of 1. Is that not the definition of insanity? Is there any reason why we might be thinking, geez, things are getting worse in the rail industry, especially when you look at all those other training program changes that were initiated as they're discussed in the death investigation report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, where you had not an experienced conductor, working with new trainees, but somebody who could have just been qualified, just as in the case of my child, where they had just been qualified, or as I would say, fake qualified with basically 0 yard training, and they were expected basically within a week to be training trainees when they themselves were on probation and subject to dismissal themselves. And so all of these changes to training programs would have been, very likely violations of the Railway Safety Act, Section 20. So it is not surprising to see that things are getting worse in the rail industry, is all I can say, especially when you then put that together with things like the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal decision tied to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, where extremely dangerous precedents were set by, and folks, We're going to cover that also, but I would very much argue that that hearing decision was prearranged before one word was even heard. And I'll show you why that is when we cover that topic of the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada. All right, so given Keith Creel was the former CN Rail EVP, Executive Vice President in charge of operations, and he oversaw operations from May of 2007 to January 2013. He left for CP Rail, I think, in February of 2013. But anyways, he definitely did oversee operations from May 2007 to 2013. So that whole 6-year period. So if there were issues with fake qualifications, as there clearly were in the September 2007 Mackyard incident, he would have had more than enough time to address some of those issues. And that's what they were supposed to do when they launched the first attempt to rewrite the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. And again, that, in my opinion, was a total and public scam. And Keith Creel, as a person overseeing operations for CN, would have definitely provided input into that entire public scam of an exercise, in my humble opinion. But anyway, so during the September 2007 Mackyard incident, which was clearly showing employees at CN Rail were not getting the training they were supposed to be getting. So for that, I would refer you to the 12 video series on the Mackyard incident of 2007, looking at the Transportation Safety Board Railway Investigation Report R07T0270. That was absolutely under Keith Creel. And then he would likely have participated in what I call, again, that public scam of a rewrite, an attempt at watering down of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, SOR 87-150, which resulted in a document known as the Rules Respecting Minimum Qualification Standards for Railway Employees, or TCO 0-102. And that public scam of a document is going to be completely analyzed. That will probably be the next thing I cover after I do this series, this video on Keith Creel. But that public scam of a document was approved by the Governor in Council on June 23, 2009. The Minister of Transportation at the time was John Baird. So would it be any surprise to see John Baird, when he left the Government of Canada, would become a board member at CP Rail and then at CPKC, where I believe he still remains. In spite of having, he would have been a party to that Governor in Council approval of that total public scam of a document, which we're going to be covering. Because the Governor in Council, when the Governor General of Canada has to approve new laws, regulations, whatever, rules, they don't, a Governor in Council, they don't have all the experience that they need. They need to rely on, there's a whole group of cabinet members that are part of these decisions. And so if it's a decision that impacts the rail industry, the Minister of Transportation would absolutely be part of the Governor and Council meeting where they would have approved these new rules respecting minimum qualification standards for railway employees, or that public scam of a document, as I like to call it. So that would have involved John Baird. Let's see, Keith Creel would have been responsible and oversaw all those extremely outdated and deadly training materials, which again, I cover the deadly training materials series. There's 9 videos, I think, on that. And some of those materials, even though they're dated 2007 and 2010, I suspect they may be much older than that. So I would refer you again to that 9 video series on deadly training materials. But a lot of that, again, would have been happening under Keith Creel. And did Keith Creel initiate any changes to conductor training programs which were discussed in the railway investigation report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. That would be R13W0260. And again, even though Keith Creel had already left CN Rail by the time Jason Clooney was killed, you know, those training program changes, and there are several of them, I suspect that they were not all initiated under Jim Vena from the time that, you know, I think Jason joined CN around May of 2013. And let's see, I believe, so, you know, Keith Creel would have been gone for maybe 4 months. So are we to believe that all these training program changes would have happened under Jim Vena? Or could some of them have happened under Keith Creel? Very likely some of them happened under Keith Creel. And I would argue that these were deadly training program changes. And for that, I would refer you to the analysis of the death investigation report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And that, I think, there's at least 10 to 14 videos there. 4 of them are placed under a different playlist having to do with acts, regulations, you know, knowing the law and stuff. But in the video series that's entitled Brainwashing, I go through the Transportation Safety Board report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, and some of that does cover the training program changes that were revealed as having happened at the time, you know, they were in place by the time conductor trainee Jason Clooney had died. So were some of those initiated under Keith Creel? Or were they all initiated under Jim Vena? I doubt they were all initiated under Jim Vena. But Vena was the chief operations officer when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. And he had 0 yard training at the time of his death, but he was on his 58th trip. They only required 45 training trips, but he was on his 58th. Why would that be? Anyways, let's see. We're going to move on here. And by the way, per the Health and Safety Officer report on page 11, conductor trainee Jason Clooney, even though he had been on 58 trips prior to his death, had never been tested in proper switch handling. 58 trips and not tested in proper switch handling. He could have been a qualified conductor by this time, but he had still not been tested in proper switch handling, according to the Health and Safety Officer's report. And that's an 80-page report. There's a lot of issues with that one too, a lot of deceptions and lies. But how can it be that you're not PMRCing or procedures monitoring for regulatory compliance a trainee who's on his 58th trip who had not yet been PMRC'd in switch handling, especially when evaluations show that he had problems with switching operations? So what's going on at CN Rail that the training was this bad? You know, CN loves to say that they had the 5-star gold training program, 5 gold star whatever training program. I'm sorry, but based on the information I've come to learn, I wouldn't even give you half a star. That's how bad, in my opinion, their training program really is, as far as what's been revealed via all these railway investigation reports and more. Okay, so there's also, so if some of these training program changes were initiated under Keith Creel and they didn't go through the Transport Canada procedures to be first filed and approved by the Minister of Transportation prior to field implementation, if those happened under Keith Creel, those would have been violations of the Railway Safety Act. Some of them could have been under Jim Vena, but I suspect some were definitely under Keith Creel. And then he was also in charge of operations, and in my opinion, very likely a person, there may be many more, who failed to ensure that track switches were properly and accurately labeled and matched documentation used by frontline rail workers. The whole issue of track switch 15 versus track switch 23. Again, issues discussed in the brainwashing series where I dissect the Transportation Safety Board report tied to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, because the switch that was wrongly flipped or reversed was actually physically labeled TS23, but all three crew members in their witness statements referred to it as TS15. Where were they getting that when the switch was labeled TS23? Had to be somewhere in the work documentation. And when I asked my child, can your documents be out of date as far as switch numbers, the answer was yes, by years. So that's why I suspect it would have been under Keith Creel's operational excellence, and of course that of Jim Venna, who then took over as COO. Let's see, Keith Creel would have been in charge of CP Rail during a March 11th, 2015 incident where there were three, in my opinion, very unqualified managers at the controls. And I'm going to be going through that investigation report R15V0046 and doing an analysis of that report too in a series, because that just shows how dangerous things really are. You see what's required to allow a manager at the controls. And in this case, there were three managers in the locomotive. And when I'm talking about managers at the controls, I'm talking about guys who could be accountants, IT employees, or programmers, people whose jobs are not regularly to be, a conductor in a locomotive. But the rail industry absolutely allows for managers at the controls. And in my opinion, that's in violation of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, because I do not see anywhere in that regulation that there are special provisions for managers at the controls. You're either a qualified conductor or you're not. And when you look at what is required for managers to be at the controls as far as their training, to me it's flabbergasting, and it's dangerous and deadly in my opinion. But anyway, we'll go on. But Keith Creel was definitely at CP Rail when an incident happened involving three managers at the controls. So more operational excellence by Keith Creel as far as what's revealed in that Transportation Safety Board report. And then let's see, you've got following also, Keith Creel was also the CEO of CP Rail during the February 4th, 2019 Field BC derailment. And that accident killed 3 crew members. And a CP Rail police officer or investigator stated that he suspected a cover-up. And there's part of the CBC News article is provided for you below here with the link for that if you care to go read that article. The CBC is the Canada Broadcasting Corporation. It's the propaganda arm of the government of Canada, basically. It's the taxpayer-funded media for the government of Canada. But anyways, this police officer, who was a CP Rail police under Keith Creel, had stated that he suspected a cover-up because he was ordered to stop investigating. Okay, well, who would have told a CP Police Rail officer to stop investigating, stop talking to witnesses, whatever? Who would have told him that? And who would have had the authority to override that if indeed there was no cover-up? Would the CEO of the company at the time, Keith Creel, not have the authority to tell this CP Rail police officer, keep doing your job, keep doing your investigation the way it needs to be done? Why would the CEO not say, forget whoever's told you to stop investigating, do your job? Unless maybe the person telling you to stop investigating is the CEO himself, or you know, his one of his people, like his chief operations officer. But again, if you're a CP Rail police officer and you're telling this to the press, would the CEO not come out and say, keep doing your job and do it properly? Invest, talk to the witnesses, whatever. But that's not what seemed to be happening. And this whole issue, I believe, is still in court. I think the families are still suing CP Rail over this particular derailment and incident that killed 3 rail workers. So, and again, there's another thing you need to remember. Should you believe everything, the CP derailment pertaining to this particular derailment, that report's out now by the Transportation Safety Board. But geez, do you think that families should believe everything they read in a Transportation Safety Board report when we clearly know of rail partners in crime? Because, the accuracy of those reports, in my opinion, is certainly to be brought into question. As far back as the Mackyard incident, which when Keith Creel was, again, overseeing Mackyard, that report was kind of a whitewash, too, of the actual facts. And again, for that, refer to the Mackyard series that I did. I think there's 12 videos on that report. And that would have been done during the Keith Creel days when he was overseeing operations at CN Rail. So, should families believe everything they see in a Transportation Safety Board report? I don't think so. Because in my opinion, there's definitely rail partners in crime. The Transportation Safety Board, Transport Canada, the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada are absolutely in bed with rail carriers to hide the truth. And there's a lot of deceptions and outright lies that go on in these reports. My humble opinion, based on what I've analyzed, you're free to form your own opinion. Okay, so what we have here is a page from the Transportation Safety Board report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And again, this was after Keith Creel had left CN Rail, but this just gives you an idea of the training program changes that had taken place. And so the question becomes, since Jim Venna was COO, Chief Operations Officer at CN after Keith Creel left, he would have been there, Jim Venna, from, it would have been February 2013, and Jason died in November. So are we to believe that all these changes, in addition to the Mackyard changes, would not have happened under, some of them would not have been under Keith Creel, that they were all under Jim Venna? I doubt it. I seriously doubt it. Because some of this stuff was happening when my child was a newly qualified conductor. And that would have been in the summer time frame, basically of the same year. So Jason died a few months later. Did all these changes happen in a 6-month period, all under Jim Venna, or could some of them been under Keith Creel? I suspect some of them were under Keith Creel. I have no way of knowing for sure, but when I requested a list of training program changes filed with Transport Canada after Jason's death, nothing like by CN Rail for approval according to the Railway Safety Act, Section 20, as should have been done for each and every one of these, I was given nothing in return. So when were these actual changes implemented in the field? Does not look like they went through Transport Canada, is what I'm saying. So some of them could have been under Keith Creel. Some of them could have been under Venna. Not sure. But anyways, it does say here, the initial 2 weeks observation trip with a qualified conductor have been cut. Oh, okay, well, previously in the Mackyard incident, it wasn't that they had been cut, it was that they had been included as field trips. But now we're being told they're specifically cut out. Was that under the operational excellence of Keith Creel or Jim Venna? And again, remember, if they've been cut, That means that Jason had 58 trial trips. You only needed 45 to be a qualified conductor. And in those 58, he still had not been PMRC'd, or procedures monitoring for regulatory compliance, for switch handling, even though CN knew he had problems with proper switch handling. Then we have here, recently qualified or less experienced conductors were permitted to train new hires. So I discuss all of these issues under the brainwashing series when I go over Jason's accident report. But, there's a lot of issues here. Some conductors who are providing on-the-job supervision are not completing the evaluations. Yeah, we knew that. And then instead of having one dedicated trainer for conductor trainees for the duration of the training, a number of conductors acted as trainers. I think that one may have been under Keith Creel, because I think that was also an issue in the backyard incident. Let's see. Then there was the conductors, unlike locomotive engineers, are not required to become familiar with the territory before working unsupervised. Actually, that is not accurate, because the Canadian Rail Operating Rules, the general section, and I think it's point 10, does state that they need to be familiar with the territory. So again, are we to believe everything that we read in a transportation safety board? I would argue that the level of expertise for some of these people who work there and write these reports is not exactly top notch. But anyway, that's my opinion. And then it says the on-the-job trainer or trainmaster does not ride along on trips to evaluate the trainee. Well, of course not, because that's a management role. The trainmaster is a management role, and they're not the ones providing the on-the-job training. But you need to look at the whole issue with made-to-fit definitions, as I discuss them again in the brainwashing series. Huge issue. But anyway, so if you look at all of these, for these to be not violations of the Railway Safety Act, they would have had to have all been filed with Transport Canada for prior review and approval prior to field implementation. And if these were part of the current training program for CN Rail, then those would have been included under the section in Jason's accident report pertaining to CN Rail's present accelerated conductor training program. But that's not where these were included. These were included in a separate section discussing changes to the training program. So that tells me, you know what, if they're not part of the current training program, these were not approved. That's what that tells me. And I think some of these date back years, long before even Jim Venna took over. But again, a good lawyer could get to these issues, and I think that's what needs to happen in order to have the proper overhaul that we need in the rail industry in both Canada and the U.S. Because again, it's people like Keith Creel who would oversee not only Canadian operations, but U.S. operations for CP. And the same thing would be true for CN. Your chief operations officer oversees both countries. So in my opinion, these are issues for both countries. The more and more I look into these issues, the more I believe that to be the case, especially since many of these rail executives have escaped to U.S. Class 1 rail carriers like CSX or Union Pacific, Norfolk Southern, whatever. And again, there's the Rail Families United YouTube channel, but there's also the UP-NS merger YouTube channel. You need to look at the information provided on both channels in order to understand all the issues 100%. Because it's just, I'm not allowed to duplicate videos. I can modify them a little bit, but I can't put all the videos that are on the Rail Families United website on the UP-NS merger channel, because things like the backyard incident, even though it explains a lot of what's going on today in the rail industry, that is more a Canadian issue than U.S., although it does explain, the fact that, in my opinion, there are people running Class 1 rail carriers in the U.S. that don't belong in boardrooms. In my opinion, they belong in courtrooms. And If I was on the jury, I'd say behind bars, but that's my opinion. You're free to form your own. Okay, so again, any of these changes, folks, when I'm discussing operational excellence, and in this case, we were looking mainly at Keith Creel, um, but, I can't say for sure that everything that was a change to a training program when it was part of the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney and those issues, they may have been just under Jim Vena, but I suspect a lot of these were also under Keith Creel. But again, people just need to understand the issues, because any changes to training programs that were not first filed and reviewed and approved by Transport Canada, if they were just implemented in the field, like maybe managers at the controls, they better have a training program for managers at the controls on file with Transport Canada um, for that issue, because I think most people looking at that will be flabbergasted when I do that series on managers at the controls. But here we're looking at changes to conductor training programs. But what about to belt pack? There's also going to be changes to belt pack training programs I'm going to be covering, and but the same issue would apply for changes to locomotive engineer training programs. Haven't even touched on that discussion. That's not an issue I've looked into. But if there were any changes to locomotive engineer training programs and those weren't approved by Transport Canada prior to field implementation, those too would be violations of the Railway Safety Act. And in the managers at the controls issue, that Transportation Safety Board report from 2015 that I'm going to be providing an analysis for, there were 3 managers at the controls. That means one of them was a locomotive engineer. And so the whole issue is not limited to just conductors. It would be, we need to look at training programs for locomotive engineers, for hustlers, for yard foremen, whatever. Any changes that were not approved by Transport Canada, if those have to do with frontline rail worker training programs, if they did not get filed and approved by Transport Canada first, before field implementations, they would have all been violations of the Railway Safety Act by the likes of Keith Creel, Jim Vena, and others, all the way up to the CEOs. So that's the issue here. And so, now that Transport Canada knows this is your year of disclosure, because I've told them this is going to be your year of disclosure, they're now in a hurry, and I told them that last year, to overhaul the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, or SOR 87-150. That exercise, it was amazingly appeared in the Canada Gazette when, the weekend that Chrystia Freeland threw Trudeau under the bus. I think that was all a perfectly orchestrated thing. And for more on that, I would encourage you to look at the players, and specifically my video on Chrystia Freeland. I think it's rather eye-opening, in my opinion. But anyway, now we have a new Minister of Transportation, because Chrystia Freeland can't wait to get the heck out of this department, the Ministry of Transportation. And so now we have Steve McKinnon, who used to be the former Minister of Labour for Canada. So I'll be doing a video on him too, because he's known of these issues since at least the CPCN rail strike in 2024. I think that was in June of 2024, where he was getting all these files that I was sending to him and stuff. So he's not innocent either in what he knows, but he's the new Minister of Transportation of Canada. So keep a very close eye on the rewrite of this critical regulation as it pertains to frontline rail worker training programs. From what I've already read online, there's a lot of issues with this new rewrite. And even the unions, they provided some feedback as to some of their issues already, but seem to be getting ignored again by the Government of Canada. For example, there's one union for the maintenance of way employees, who are the track maintenance guys, who would like to have to be included in the training regulation, but oh, we don't want to go there. Transport Canada doesn't want to do that. Why not? You know, they move cranes. They have to do with the movement of equipment and whatever. They perform critical roles in keeping the rail industry safe. They're the ones that don't just fix the track. They have to maintain the hot boxes, the signals, everything. So why do they not get their own special training under the regulation? That absolutely needs to happen. But I don't think that they're planning on doing that. So folks, if you are a rail investor, a rail customer, a frontline rail worker, or a family of a rail worker, voice your opinions with now Minister of Transportation McKinnon, and let them know that we need to include track maintenance workers in the regulation. You know, that regulation hasn't been updated in 38 years. We don't have another 38 years for Transport Canada to get it right. All right, I think I'm going to end this video here. I hope it was an enlightening one, because, you know, again, when you're doing research, remember, don't necessarily trust everything that comes back in a computer search, because the AI, artificial intelligence, may not be accurate. You really have to do your homework and make sure that you're getting the proper players. And, you know, there are so many of them. That's why, you know, this whole players series is going to be quite long. And I encourage you to look at all of the players and understand their roles. Many of them have crossed into the U.S. rail industry, and this impacts all of Canada and all of the U.S. And so I'm going to end this video here. So on that one, have a great day, and I will see you on the next one.